Okay, anybody that doesn't know me, my name is Wayne Davis, and as president of the Newfoundland Coasters Heritage Society, I have to learn how to pronounce that. I'd like to welcome you on this historic occasion, the first public meeting of the Newfoundland Coasters Historic Society. And of course, I'd like to thank the Marine Institute and Mr. Captain Wayne Norman and the Student Council for putting up notices and what have you. I'd also like to thank Mr. Brian White and the Extension Services Co-op from Bond Street. They're going to record and document this historic meeting so that as part of our exhibits over the years ahead, they can pull it out and play it for people who are interested in this subject. And we try and keep the program fairly quickly, so I won't be very long. Growing up in Bonavista Bay, as a little fellow, I remember a well-known captain, a fellow named Captain Boyce Winger. He had a vessel called the Prince Andrew, and one day I heard him say, he said, and Paddy Miller probably laughed, but he said, Harbour Deep, Croak, and Mary's Harbour are the three best harbors on the Labrador. And I went around Wesleyville and I said, Harbour Deep, Croak, Mary's Harbour are the three best harbors on the Labrador. And my father used to say, yes, boy, no doubt about it, you know. And some years later, I picked up an atlas and you know, I looked and I said, my goodness, you know, Harbour Deep and Croak is not even on the Labrador. It's on the French shore. So I realized, of course, that there's a lot more to this business of the coasting trade than you see at first glance. And then some years later, I had the occasion to come in the Narrows on a vessel, about almost a quarter of a century. I don't want to give away my age or anything, but came in the Narrows on a vessel. And well, I'll tell you, it was the Andrew C. Crosby. And there was snow. It was just before Christmas, snow all over the place. And Jack Frost was everywhere. Everything was froze up on the deck. And I thought about the poet, you know, when he says that, oh, what a fool in every kind of way to be here and hauling frozen ropes on blessed Christmas Day. And so I thought about years ago when my mother used to say, boy, be a school teacher, you know, don't go to sea. And so anyways, looking back, I keep thinking that going to sea and working in and around ships, it's not a job, it's not a vocation, and or a position or whatever you want to call it. I guess pure and simply, it's a culture. In other words, it's not a job, it's a culture. So for a number of years we talked about trying to preserve some of the history of the Newfoundland coasting trade, to do some research and documentation, and meetings like this is a part of that process. And so we have a couple of guests tonight, and without delaying, our first speaker, Capt Morrissey Johnson, has been a long time involved in the coasting trade and the seal fishery and what have you, and he doesn't need much of an introduction to you people, so I'd like you to make welcome Capt Morrissey Johnson.
Thanks very much, Wayne. I always thought it was conch crouse and croak that were the three best harbors on the Labrador. Neither one of them were across the streets, but I guess you did much the same as I did, Wayne. Played around on a lot of coasting vessels when you were growing up as a boy. I know that the other night I was figuring out that I had said in the message in the brochure that there were hundreds and perhaps even thousands of vessels engaged over the years in the coasting trade here in Newfoundland. And then I thought, maybe I was saying thousands, that was too many, but then I looked at the founding board of directors, and I thought about Pat and Skipper Mike and yourself and ourselves, and I said, well, we must have 4 or 5 vessels. And then I started to take a pencil and mark down how many vessels I could remember that Pat's family had, and your family, and ourselves. Instead of 4 or 5 that we had, it was 12. I had been skipper on 9 of them. I counted 12, I think, that I had the names of in Pat's family, but I know that he had other vessels, Paddy had other vessels, that I couldn't remember the names of them. So he must have had 15 or so since the first time that I met Pat in Catalina, when his 2 of his brothers were there and his father. They were getting one of their vessels that they had a new house put on it. But anyway, I was told when I was to speak this evening that I had probably 12 or 15 minutes to make my remarks. I got half of that used up, and I haven't even looked at my paper yet. I want to say that it's a bit ironic, but merely a coincidence, that we would be having this meeting this evening on the anniversary of the beginning of one of the most epic voyages of any vessel, perhaps in our coasting trade history. And by now you probably know I'm referring to the motor vessel, or not the motor vessel, the three-masted schooner, as she was when she left St. John's 66 years ago today, perhaps only an hour or 2 before this time. And she arrived at her destination that she set out for, Newtown, which is not very far north of Cape Bonavista, just across the bay, 117 days after. She got drifted off, of course, and ended up in Scotland, up in northern Scotland. Well, as a people, we're very fortunate that the story of that voyage from St. John's to Newtown was recorded for posterity by our master, Captain Job Barber, in his book, 48 Days Adrift. And here we are, 66 years later, after all the times that it's been talked about that we needed an association like this to record events like the voyage of the Niption. Here we are trying to get an organization off the ground that can try to research and record and preserve information about people and other events similar to that of the voyage of the Niption too. The need for this organization, the Newfoundland Coasters Heritage Society, has been talked about for years. I know I've been in the company of many people who've talked about it, and I have to say that gives me great pleasure to say this evening that it was the initiative of Wayne Davis, Captain Wayne Davis, who called a group of us who had been involved in the coasting trade over the years. Last fall he called us and asked us what do we think of the idea of getting a society together, and he mentioned a friend of most of us who was deceased, Captain Roland Bennett, who had given Wayne the idea some years ago. Well, I'm glad, Wayne. I think that in the future Newfoundlanders will be grateful for the initiative that you took to set this up. Now, a lot of people probably don't realize how much time is involved in trying to get an organization like this off the ground. I was disappointed this evening because there were not more people turned up, but then that disappointment disappeared when I was talking to our guest speaker, who was a founding member of a similar organization, and he said that it was several years before they got any large body of people coming along to their meetings. But it took us several meetings before we got our constitution and bylaws drafted. But in March we had the society incorporated, and we got legal advice on the wording of the constitution and the bylaws from a very prominent St. John's lawyer. He's here with us tonight, Mr. John C. Ottenheimer. I was hoping that there would have been a big crowd, and when I said John C., everybody was going to think there was going to be John Crosby. So then I was going to say Hottenheimer, and everybody's face was going to, oh. But anyway, John, I want to take advantage of this opportunity to thank you publicly for the help that you gave us. John, by the way, didn't make any charges for his services, and for that we're very grateful. And we're also grateful to Mr. Brian White and Neil Tilley of the Extension Community Development Cooperative Society. They hosted most of our meetings in their offices down on Bond Street, and they provided other invaluable services as well. They did typing and photocopying, phoned around to let us know when there was going to be another meeting, and did some mail-outs and so on like that. And they also kept the minutes of the meeting so while we were waiting to elect a secretary. So I want to acknowledge that and say that we're grateful to them also. Mrs. Shani Duff and Barbara Crosby, they gave Wayne tremendous encouragement to form the association, and they're not here, but nevertheless I'll offer them thanks as well. Now, when we first got organized, we did have one problem, and that was a place where we could hold our meetings without incurring expenses for rent while we were trying to get the organization going. And we were very fortunate in this respect because one of our members is also a member of the Newfoundland Transport Historical Society, and they were very gracious in providing us a meeting place in the exhibit hall of the Newfoundland Transport Museum. Now, I guess most of you probably know where the museum is. If you don't and you've never been there, I would encourage you to go, because they have very good exhibitions up there, and our guest speaker was one of the founding members of that museum. They're located on at 212 Mount Sile Road. And we're working in cooperation with the Newfoundland Transportation Museum, and if you've got one of our brochures, you'll see that it's mentioned there on the bottom of the page, and again on the inside cover. We're proud that we're working with that cooperation, and we hope that they'll be some of the means of us being successful in achieving our objectives. On the inside of the mission statement, which I want to go through with you while I'm making my remarks. As you can see, it's a modest affair. I got to thank Derek. He ran them off on a photocopying machine, but he did a very good job. As you can see, we have a sailing vessel as our logo, because most vessels, the first vessels, I suppose, involved in the coasting trade around Newfoundland were sailing vessels. So that's what we chose as our logo. Down in the bottom, we have preserving a tradition in shipping, which is what this society is all about. And of course, either one of us could be in the picture there of the people, because it's about the people of the past, people of the present, and people of the future. That's what this society is all about. We want to make sure that a legacy that's handed down to us is passed on to future generations. I'm getting away from my speech because I think it's much better among a small crowd to be less formal than I would if the place was filled up. And it'd be nice if I could say to somebody standing up in the back, there's a seat or two left down in the front, but nevertheless, my message is just as sincere. First of all, I want to say that I think it's an indisputable fact that people living in communities around our coastline were dependent for their very existence on water transportation. And most of their needs, their shipping needs, were provided by vessels plying the coast from St. John's and other places, back and forth, bringing freight to them, bringing back some stuff that they had produced, and like lumber and fish and cod oil and everything like that. So it's a pity, in my opinion, that we haven't done something before to record the history of all those vessels that took part in the coasting trade. And I think that now it's still not too late. There's a lot of the information that is lost to us forever. When the people are dead and gone, it was never written down, and now we're depending on a lot of people, I suppose, from memory to tell us some of the stories. I suppose there's still some artifacts out there that we might be able to gather up. There should be lots of pictures that we can obtain. People might want to donate or so on like that. If they're too sentimental to part with them, we can always get them reproduced so that we can exhibit them, so that people coming along behind us will have something to look at and remember a proud heritage. In the brochure, there's two pictures. Now, some of you will know which vessels they are as soon as you glance at them. Others may not be as fortunate as to have been involved very much with those vessels and don't know who they are. But first of all, I want to say that most, I suppose, of the vessels that were used in our coasting trade were built there in Newfoundland, and they were built of wood, most of them. But a lot of them, vessels, were bought from Nova Scotia and New Brunswick and other parts of mainland Canada. A lot of them were former fishing vessels, banking schooners. In recent years, the last 20 or so years, or perhaps going back to 30 years, most of the vessels going into the Newfoundland coastal trade were steel vessels built in the United Kingdom or somewhere in Europe, and they were brought over. Mostly UK boats were a preference because up until a few years ago you didn't have to pay any import duty on them. So I wouldn't want to leave the impression that all of the vessels that were in the coasting trade only did coasting. Some of them made foreign-going voyages, or if you want to put it another way, I suppose we could say international voyages. It's got more of a good feeling with it, I suppose. But anyway, that was a fact. As you all know, in the fall of the year, the coasting trade pretty well comes to an end, and wintertime, they used the boats in other trades to try to keep them going. If they were big enough and strong enough to weather the Atlantic storms, a lot of them carried cargoes of fish and other commodities to Europe and to the West Indies, down to South America and so on like that. But anyway, we have two vessels there, the Glenwood and the Archer Mackenzie. Now, there's no information in the brochure about either one of those vessels. And I suppose if you had to adequately describe the vessels and tell the history associated with the two of them, it'd take you an hour, and I don't know if you'd even touched on the subject then. So I haven't got an hour, but I would like to say a little bit about them, and for that purpose, so that I want to screw up in anything that I have to say, I'm going to more or less go by what I wrote down this afternoon. And the Glenwood was 329 gross tons. She had an overall length of 137 feet, or at least that's what I think she had. I didn't have any records that I could refer to find that out. She was the largest of the two vessels in our brochure, and she was built one of 10 sister ships back in 1940 for the government of Newfoundland. In the first few years of her life, which she was owned by the government of Newfoundland, she was used almost exclusively in the West Indies trade, on international voyages, carrying down fish, bringing back salt, sometimes bringing back molasses. Now, there were 5 or 6 of them that were used in that trade, but some of them were used around Newfoundland. But anyway, in 1950, I believe it was, around that time, shortly after Confederation, she was bought by Dan Frampton Limited here in St. John's, and they used her primarily in the coasting trade. But in the early 1950s, when the Dew line was being built up north, she did make several trips up in the Arctic with supplies, and I believe on the picture there, she's got a load of sticks, and that's somewhere up north then when she's got material for the distant early warning line. But anyway, the coasting trade, like lots of other things in Newfoundland, started to decline in the 60s, and in 1969, Frampton's sold the Glenwood to owners down in New Brunswick. And she was sold to be an earring smacker. In other words, she followed the earring seiners out in the Bay of Fundy, and when they hauled their seines, if they had earring, they pumped her full, and she brought it back into the reduction plants. But the herring fishery started to go down, dropped off, slump, and she was a casualty of that slump. And I don't know if she was deliberately beached, but anyway, she ended up on a beach, and she's still resting on a beach, a derelict on Campobello Island. Now, I have to mention this because in 1985, when I was a member of Parliament, Skipper Max, whom we all know, passed on a few days ago. Skipper Max Frampton, who had been skipper on her for several years, approached me, and he said, you know, I was up, he said, Derek and myself were up looking at the Glenwood. You know, it's a shame, he said, that we've got no floating museum in Newfoundland. And I said, yes, I remember a few years before that we were going to try to get together to get some money between us to stop one of the boats that Puddester had from going to the mainland. We couldn't get enough money, so she sailed away. That was another one gone. But anyway, I went to different government departments. I talked till I almost got blue in the face to people. I couldn't get anybody that was interested in committing enough money that we could take something like that on. It was going to be a fantastic lot of money to restore it, but I couldn't get nobody to make a commitment. They would rather waste the money, I suppose, in outdoor rinks and stuff like that. But anyway, finally, I gave up trying. I talked to Max, and we were disgusted, so we gave up on the idea. I think that she would have made a splendid floating museum. Now then, that brings me along to talk about the Archie Mackenzie. Now, the Archie Mackenzie was quite different from the Glenwood. She was designed and built as a sailing schooner to fish cod on the fishing banks off Nova Scotia and the Grand Banks off of Newfoundland. She was built in Shelburne in 1924. She was 81 tons gross and 96 feet long overall. The owners that had her built, they used her for fishing for 20 years or so, and then they sold her to Mr. Chess Forsey in Grand Bank, and he used her in the coasting trade. In 1947, Skipper Mike and his family needed a vessel for the Labrador fishery, so they bought the Archie F. Mackenzie in 1947. Mike used her in the Labrador fishery until 1951. I know that he made a few trips coasting in the fall of the year after coming out of Labrador, because the first time that I saw the Archie Mackenzie, I met her when I was coming south and Mike was going north across Bonavista Bay, and I saw her with the sails on her, good fresh breeze of wind, enough to make the spray fly, and I thought, what a beautiful looking schooner. But anyway, the Labrador fishery started to fail. So in 1951, Mike put her back in the coastal trade again. And when he had bought her, there was an old Fairbanks engine in her. He didn't buy her with the engine at all. That was taken out of her before he bought her. But he put a gasoline engine, a Red Wing, I think it was it Mike? put a small gasoline engine in her, and he used her like that until he went into the coasting trade, and then he put a Kelvin engine, I think it was an 88 horsepower Kelvin engine in her. But in 1959, he completely rebuilt her. He gave her a facelifting. The stern was altered, the tall masts were taken off her, the sails done away with. He built a deckhouse on her, and he put a new 180 horsepower a Kelvin engine in her, and that's how she emerged on the scene again as a coaster, a genuine motor vessel. Well, Mike used her until 1974. Then another declining in the coasting trade. As I already mentioned, Frampton sold their boat in 69 because of the decline in the coasting trade. The roads had opened up, trucks, cars, and aeroplanes and helicopters were being used to transport commodities of goods, so there's not much use for vessels anymore. So Mike sold Archie Mackenzie to a group in Quebec. Now, I have to comment, Mike, because I think when he built her, he must have used superb craftsmanship. Because here it is, 36 years later, and now she's 71 years old, and she's operating on the Saguenay River as a sightseeing vessel taking tourists out looking at whales and so on like that. Now, I believe that despite the fact that she spent a lot of her time, built as a fishing vessel, spent a lot of her time in the Grand Banks fishery, in the Labrador fishery, that after 25 years in the coasting trade around our coast, on the south coast, on our east coast, Labrador coast, coasting, as we call it, that I think that she deserves to be remembered as a Newfoundland coaster. I'm glad that we had a picture of her to put in our brochure.
And Captain Michael as well.
And Captain Mike is one of the founding members of our society. Anyway, I don't know where I'm going to get back to now. I'm rambling away so much now that I have to say, I suppose, that there probably are not a great number of people today in Newfoundland that know that there were 10 sister ships, 10 vessels like the Glenwood built in Clarenville. That's how Clarenville Shipyard started, was to build those vessels, because it was during the war years. A lot of vessels had been put ashore. They weren't confiscated, but almost so, because the Admiralty told you if you had anything, any size at all, where you had to go. A lot of the vessels were going up to New Brunswick, hauling lumber down, and they had sailed with sealed orders, just the same as if they were in the Navy. They wouldn't know where they were going till they got outside the harbour. Or at least that's what they said. Might have stretched it a little bit, but they had to have fuel enough aboard to go, I suppose. But that's what they were doing. They were taken out of the coasting trade and put into foreign trade, because Canada was a foreign country to us at that time. So they were coasters, but they were in the foreign trade. And the reason why I mentioned that about a lot of people not knowing that those vessels might even have existed, because maybe there are a lot of them that know that they were built there that wouldn't be able to name those boats today. They were all named after Newfoundland communities, each one of them. But I bet that you could meet a lot of people on the street and ask them, what were the names of the splinter fleet, the Clarenville boats, as we used to call them? What were their names? Boy, I don't know. There was some boats built out there, wasn't it? Now, I think that that's shameful for us, with such a maritime history, to not have something like that recorded, so that our children and our children's children can see how we existed. We had no roads, only you could go from here, I suppose, to Carbonear, out around the bay. I think in 1947 we probably had the first hookup down from Bonavista. That was probably done to go down to the Bonavista Peninsula as part of the celebrations of Cabot, and we called it the Cabot Highway. In other words, we've done away with that. They don't call it that anymore now, the Cabot Highway. It's not the Cabot Eye anymore. There's the Discovery Trail. So that's how what we've done with our history here in Newfoundland. Every vessel that we had, that we should have had, one on the west coast in Corner Brook, one in St. John's, one up on the Burin Peninsula, preserved so that people could go aboard and look at it. for tourists to go aboard and look at. You go in Lunenburg, and they have fishing, banking schooner. They have one there that was built for rum running. They have an old dragger. I nearly cried when I saw the Eagle be towed out of St. John's, took out and sunk, the last of the wooden walls. But anyway, this is what we're trying to do as a society. It's a start. There are 8 or 10 of us that are founding members, and we'll get some more. People that come along who are interested, we generate enough interest that they'll come around, hopefully, and fill this off after a year or two. So we haven't got to be discouraged by a small turnout. I'm pleased that I have the opportunity to be here this evening, and I want to say that it's not only for future generations that we have to collect and preserve and exhibit stories and artifacts of ships from our coasting trade. There's only, count them all on the one end now, what's left, I suppose. You might squeeze the ferries that we're using around our island on the 2 ends too. There's only half a dozen or so vessels left. Some soon to be, people, what the hell are they talking about, coaster? What's that, a coaster? Is that something where you put on the table to put your drink on? You know, they won't know the difference of it. But I think the onus is on us. But we can't do it. We can't gather that information unless we get an expanded membership for the society. We need hundreds of people. We need branches in places like Lewisport that the people in that surrounding area can go to. We need branch in Corner Brook. We need one down on the Burin Peninsula, on the Bonavista Peninsula. We need branches of our society that people can go to, realize what we're trying to do, and when we have a meeting in St. John's, some of them might be able to fill up a car and come in. We know that it's costly to travel those days, but if we got one representative from an area to come in so that we can try to expand our ideas and achieve the objections that we've set out to undertake here. So I believe that you've all gotten a brochure when you came in, and you see on the back of it where there's a picture of our logo, the schooner. I had one there. I don't know what I've done with it now. But anyway, thanks, Wayne. We've got an application for membership here. That's one important thing, the application for membership, because any of you who have the desire, you have to have the desire to want to do something about some of the things to help achieve some of the objectives set out on this inside cover here to become a member. We'll take you if you, as a member, to get your $10, even if you haven't got the desire. But we want you to have the desire and to be willing to part with your $10 so that we can get a bit of money to start to do something. Now, we've been talking about it since March. The summer came on us and we figured, well, it's no good to try to get a membership drive going then. Perhaps we should have had a garden party and said that we were going to hand out something, and we would have got a big crowd and then took advantage of it and tried to solicit them to become members. But we didn't do that, so we're here now. We're appealing to you who are not members of the association to try to spread the word. Try to spread the word about the association. Tell people about the brochure, what's on it, and so on like that, what we're attempting to do. And hopefully, of those of you that are not members, that there's a sample of our membership card up here at the top. Our mailing address is here in the center. And we hope that you'll fill out the membership application, mail it to our mailing address, and in the not-too-distant future, that we'll see your name on an original membership card. Never mind the sample. We only put that there as a teaser, more or less, just an appetizer to get you to join. So I don't want to carry on any further. I got completely away from the text what I had prepared. I think I might have used a couple of paragraphs of it, but the rest of it is emotion, because I am emotional about this. I've spent, since I was not very old, probably I might have been the same age as what Paddy was when he started in the coasting trade, enough for to climb over the bulwarks anyway, but I started going to sea as a deckhand getting paid in 1948. Now, I had been going every summer when school closed. From the time that I was 7 years old, I thought it was wonderful to get aboard the schooner in the summer and go on a trip round the coast, up to Joe Bat's Arm, Erin Neck, and all those places. And now I look back and say, I should have been home learning how to swim like the rest of the boys my age, but I didn't. I was too busy being away, wanting to be a man before I was properly grown together, I suppose. But anyway, that's the fact, and that's like a lot of us here in Newfoundland. A lot of us did that. I'm not saying nothing, trying to dramatize it, that's true facts. But anyway, I do have a sense of guilt because I've heard people talking about we should have had an association going. Yes, we should have. But we didn't take time. We didn't take time. We didn't have the initiative to get a society going. It would have been lovely, wonderful, if it had been going 20, 25 years ago. But here we are now, it's 1995, it's still not too late. And as I want to say again, I want to emphasize that it was the initiative of Wayne took that got us as far as what we are today.